a high mountain there was a peaceful town. All the streets were steep and were lined with houses of tightly fitted stone. The countryside lay far below, and was a pale patchwork of olive groves and orchards, of snaking streams and ribbon roads. All roads led to the top of the mountain, and there a somber church dominated the square. Its columns were gouged and pitted, and the steps were so worn that entering was difficult. A new dome crowned the church, and a new cross gleamed above. The old part of the church was once a Roman temple, and before that Etruscans had worshipped on the site. But there was no trace of them except for the broken pottery that lay in the fields behind. The space between the columns was bricked in, and the pagan altar was fitted over with stone panels. They were carved with images of peacocks, crosses, cups, and vines. The interior of the new dome was masterfully painted. Christ frowned over the altar, and the Last Judgment with its gates of hell loomed over the main door, a constant warning before exiting onto the square. The townspeople were proud of their church and its decorations, especially the large golden cross which stood victoriously on the top of the dome and could be seen from every place in the town. It was spring. The winter snows had melted, leaving the earth wet and the streams running high. Farmers marked their fields, and flowers filled the window boxes on all the houses. And during this spring, in the month of April, their church had been selected to host a very important conference. Scholarly nuns, abbesses, lady superiors, priests, and bishops would meet for solemn consultation. Even a cardinal was expected. Many grave matters of the church would be discussed, explained, documented, reaffirmed, disputed, picked apart, meditated upon, wrangled over, resubmitted, tabulated, gravely documented, reaffirmed, disputed, discussed again, meditated upon again, wrangled over again. Brother Matteo was hoeing a little vegetable patch behind the church when his tool struck a hollow-sounding object. He pushed away the earth and examined the curious find. It was made of a reddish clay and fit comfortably into his palm. It was shaped like a tiny pomegranate and was covered with little nicks and scratches. He brushed off more earth and turned it over, and something inside tumbled freely and caused a rattling sound. On the reverse, a smiling satyr's face beamed back at Brother Matteo. He took it to the water trough, immersed it, and shook it vigorously. He examined it closely. Shiny beads of water disappeared into the absorbent surface. It was a fine object, and he thought it must be very old. He shook it several times, smiled, and put it into his pocket. It was the morning of the conference. The cardinal had arrived from Rome with 3 bishops close behind. 4 learned nuns representing 4 convents followed. 2 abbesses who had studied at Padua made their way up the mountain, and 3 lady superiors from Tuscany soon joined them. Many priests and brothers came, and all the clergy in the town, including Brother Matteo. Last of all came the secretaries with their parchment and pens. They would record the results of the conference and present this to the Pope himself. Justi et Dominis exandivit eos en ex omnibus tribulantenes equorum liberate eos ibat benedictum. In ome tempore semper las eos eo mero gloria Deus qui nos ama beatur Mariatur Marcellini. The proceedings, to say the least, were extremely long-winded, slow, dull, wearisome, and poky, especially to Brother Matteo, who was indeed a holy man, but had little interest in such church matters. He was more down to earth, and would much rather gossip with the parishioners than confer with the clergy. His mind was on more practical issues, like what to do with the leftover communion wine, or which pastries should be given up for Lent. By chance, a very pretty abbess was seated next to him. From time to time, she turned her lovely eyes towards him, and as the proceedings became more intolerably stupid, she looked at Matteo with a pitying smile, nodded in the direction of the officiating bishop, and faked a yawn. Matteo silently replied by closing both eyes and shrugging his broad shoulders. She noted that he was remarkably good-looking and of a strong build. She smiled again, showing her pretty white teeth. Matteo responded with a very unclerical wink and shook his forefinger. This communication could only be shared in sparingly, and soon the brother's mind wandered to the little clay pomegranate in his pocket. He slipped it out and gazed at the smiling satyr's face. He nudged the abbess, pointing to the smiling face, then to the grim bishop. He turned it over and tried to make sense out of the inscriptions. It was a peculiarity of Brother Matteo's to read while moving his lips, and sometimes to softly pronounce the syllables. So his mouth formed words as his finger moved around the pomegranate. The abbess, being a curious woman, leaned over and read after him. So without realizing it, they had read aloud a conjuration. In a few seconds, thick ivy covered the walls of the church. No one could enter or leave. Then horns began to grow on some of the men, and on others ears appeared like fawns or jackasses. The hair on the nuns and abbesses grew out luxuriantly, and their habits fell to the floor. The looks of all were greatly improved. Withered old abbots became plump and rosy, thin ascetics became lithe and lusty. The eyes of all grew large and startling, wild and seductive. It was a wondrous change. Then the pretty abbess shouted, "All ye who hear my voice, be merry and rejoice." And they did. All present began to laugh and dance, and they burst into mad, irregular songs. Then Matteo shouted, "Let no grim devils mock us, while we worship jolly Bacchus." The merriment grew wilder. Satyrs pranced in, bearing great flasks of wine. The revelers cast away their gowns and capes, and covered themselves with ivy. The bishop became a mighty man with curly locks and bulging muscles. He drank lustily from a flask, then picked up the cardinal and ran off. The Mother Superior twirled her rosary beads and danced a jig. Into the room came a donkey, all swagged with garlands. A plump priest mounted the beast, and around they rode, followed by the whole reckless troop. The paintings on the dome overhead changed to images of gardens and angels, and Cupid drew his bow. Raise your eyes and look above, let us all make merry love. They obeyed and kept it up all night. The two instigators tumbled behind the altar. At last, Brother Matteo and the pretty abbess, who certainly had had their full share of the festivities, began to ponder how all this revelry, which they had begun, was to be brought to an end. So putting their heads together, they studied the clay pomegranate, and thought that perhaps they should recite it backwards. And when they read it, a change came over everything and every one. In an instant all were silent. The horns and long ears vanished. Gone were the garlands and ivy. The donkey faded into air. At that instant all forgot everything, all except Brother Matteo and the pretty abbess, who laughed it over and kept the secret well.